He came to the park every day to feed the birds, moving slowly with his cane, looking like easy prey to the gang of vandals. When they shoved him off the bench and started beating him for sport, they laughed at his pleas for mercy. But when their fists tore his jacket open, exposing a faded seal trident tattoo on his weathered chest, the morning joggers stopped running and started staring, because that wasn't just any old man they were attacking. That was a ghost from Team 5, and ghosts have a way of haunting those who disturb them. The morning sun painted Riverside Park in soft gold, casting long shadows between the oak trees that had stood sentinel over the walking paths for nearly a century. At 6:15 a.m., the park belonged to the early risers, joggers with their measured breathing, dog walkers following familiar routes, and old-timers who came to feed the pigeons before the world fully woke up. Frank Whisper Donovan had been part of that last group for 3 years now, ever since his wife Margaret had passed and the house on Elm Street became too quiet to bear. Every morning, rain or shine, he made his way to the same bench near the pond, carrying a paper bag filled with breadcrumbs and birdseed that he bought with his pension checks. At 73, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had been through hell and back. His left leg bore the ghost of an old shrapnel wound from Da Nang, and his right shoulder never quite sat right after a parachute malfunction over Cambodia in 72. The wooden cane in his weathered hand wasn't just for show, it was necessity wrapped in dignity. Most people who saw him assumed he was just another forgotten veteran, shuffling through his golden years with nothing but memories and social security checks. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Frank lowered himself onto his usual bench with a soft grunt, setting the paper bag beside him and unscrewing the thermos of black coffee that would be his only breakfast until lunch. The pigeons knew his routine better than most humans did, and they were already gathering at his feet, cooing their morning greetings. "Morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said quietly, reaching into the bag and scattering the first handful of crumbs. "Hope you slept better than I did." Sleep had been elusive lately, filled with dreams that felt more like memories, and memories that felt more like warnings. But the birds didn't need to know about that. They just needed breakfast, and Frank needed the purpose that feeding them provided. For 20 minutes, the world was peaceful. Pigeons pecked at crumbs, squirrels ventured closer for their share, and a few early joggers nodded politely as they passed. This was Frank's favorite time of day, when the park still belonged to those who appreciated quiet moments. But then the peace shattered. "Yo, old man!" The voice carried the aggressive confidence of youth, mixed with stupidity, cutting through the morning calm like a rusty blade. Frank didn't look up immediately, hoping the call wasn't meant for him, but the sound of multiple footsteps approaching on the gravel path told him otherwise. 5 teenagers, maybe 16 or 17 years old, walked toward his bench with the swagger of predators who had found easy prey. They wore baggy jeans, hooded sweatshirts, and the kind of sneers that came from too much time and too little supervision. The leader, a tall kid with acne scars and dead eyes, stopped directly in front of Frank's bench. "You deaf, Grandpa?" Frank looked up slowly, taking in the group with the kind of calm assessment that had once kept him alive in places where carelessness meant death. 5 kids, probably looking for trouble to fill their empty morning. The smart play would be to leave. "Just feeding the birds, son," Frank said quietly. "No harm in it." "No harm?" The kid laughed, and the others joined in like a pack of hyenas. "You're taking up our bench, old man. We come here to hang out, and you're making the place look like a nursing home." Frank's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Park's big enough for everyone." "Not when you smell like mothballs and failure," said another kid. "This one's shorter and stockier, with arms covered in amateur tattoos. Why don't you go die somewhere else?" The words stung more than Frank cared to admit, but he'd heard worse from better men. He began gathering his things, moving with deliberate slowness. "I'll find another spot." But standing up was his mistake. The moment Frank rose from the bench, leaning heavily on his cane, the lead kid saw weakness. And weakness, to predators, was an invitation. "Where you going so fast, Pops?" The teenager stepped closer, crowding Frank's space. "Maybe you should pay a toll for using our bench." "I don't have much," Frank said. his free hand moving instinctively toward his wallet. Few dollars, maybe. Few dollars? The kid's eyes lit up with cruel amusement. That's insulting, old man. What else you got? Before Frank could answer, Hans shoved him hard from behind. He stumbled forward, his cane skittering across the gravel as he fought to keep his balance. The bag of birdseed exploded across the path, sending pigeons scattering in alarm. Frank hit the bench hard, pain shooting through his hip as he bounced off the wooden slats and crashed to the ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "Oops," laughed the stocky kid. "Grandpa fell down." Frank tried to push himself up, but a boot caught him in the ribs, rolling him onto his back. Another kick landed in his stomach, and he curled up instinctively, protecting his vital organs the way he'd been trained decades ago in a different kind of hell. "Please," he gasped, the word tearing from his throat. "Just take what you want and go." "What we want," said the leader, kneeling down to grab Frank's jacket, "is to teach you some respect." His fist connected with Frank's jaw, snapping the old man's head to the side. Stars exploded behind Frank's eyes, and he tasted blood. "Stop," he whispered. "Please, just stop." But they didn't stop. Kicks rained down on his legs, his back, his arms. Fists found his face, his chest, anywhere they could reach. The teenagers laughed as they worked, taking turns like it was a game. Frank curled tighter, trying to protect himself, trying to become small enough that they'd lose interest. But the beating continued, each impact sending fire through his aged bones. And then, in their enthusiasm to cause pain, one of the kids grabbed Frank's jacket to pull him upright for better access to his face. The fabric, weakened by age and violence, tore along the seam. The ripping sound seemed to echo in the morning air, followed by a moment of sudden stillness. There, exposed on Frank's weathered chest, was a tattoo that made the world stop turning. A Navy SEAL trident, black ink faded but unmistakable, etched deep into skin that had seen more combat than these punks had seen movies. Below it, in smaller letters that were harder to read but impossible to mistake, Team 5, Silent Death. The teenagers stared, suddenly uncertain. They knew enough about military tattoos to recognize something serious when they saw it, but they didn't fully understand what they were looking at. But someone else did. Marcus Thompson had been jogging the same route for 5 years, ever since his discharge from the Marine Corps and his transition to civilian life in the city. He'd been approaching the pond area when he heard the commotion, and now he stood frozen on the path, his morning run forgotten. Because Marcus recognized that tattoo. Not personally, he'd never served with SEALs, but he'd seen it in briefings, in classified files, in the kind of military documents that made hardened Marines speak in whispers. SEAL Team 5 wasn't just any unit. They were the ghosts, the ones who went places that didn't exist to do things that never happened. And Silent Death wasn't a nickname. It was a reputation earned in blood. Marcus looked at the teenagers, still standing over the old man they'd been beating, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. These kids had no idea what they'd just done. They'd attacked a living legend, a man who had once been America's most lethal silent weapon. The lead teenager, still holding Frank's torn jacket, looked around nervously. "What's this old freak's deal with the weird tattoo?" Marcus found his voice. "Step away from him." The kids turned, seeing the jogger for the first time. Marcus wasn't particularly imposing, average height, lean build, wearing running shorts and a Patriots t-shirt, but there was something in his voice that made them hesitate. "Mind your own business, jogger boy," the stocky kid said, but his bravado sounded forced. "That is my business," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Frank's prone form. "You have no idea what you've done." Frank was trying to sit up now, blood running from his nose, his jacket hanging in tatters around his shoulders. The tattoo was fully exposed, impossible to ignore. Marcus stepped closer, his phone already in his hand. Not to call the police, not yet, but to call someone else, someone who would understand the significance of what he was seeing. "Who is he?" asked one of the younger teenagers, fear creeping into his voice for the first time. Marcus looked at the kid with something approaching pity. "He's someone you should have left alone." Frank finally managed to sit up, leaning against the bench. His face was swollen, his breathing labored, but his eyes held something that made the teenagers take an involuntary step back. "Frank Donovan," Marcus said quietly, reading the name from a memory file he'd seen years ago. "SEAL Team 5. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Cambodia. Classified operations in places that don't appear on maps." The teenagers looked between Marcus and Frank, confusion and growing fear warring on their young faces. "So what?" the leader said, but his voice cracked slightly. "He's just some old soldier. We were just having fun." "Fun?" Marcus's voice went cold. "You just assaulted a man who has more confirmed kills than all of you have birthdays." That statement hit like a physical blow. The teenagers stared at Frank with new eyes, seeing not a helpless old man but something far more dangerous. Frank spoke for the first time since the beating began, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that cut through the morning air like a blade. "I came here to feed the birds," he said, struggling to his feet with painful slowness. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone." The way he said it, calm, matter-of-fact, without threat or bluster, was somehow more terrifying than any angry outburst would have been. Marcus stepped forward to help Frank stand, and as he did, he whispered something in the old man's ear that made Frank's battered face almost smile. "What did you tell him?" the lead teenager demanded. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. Marcus looked at the kid with cold eyes. "I told him that sometimes the past has a way of catching up with people who disturb the wrong ghosts." The teenagers backed away, suddenly understanding that they were in waters far deeper than they'd imagined. This wasn't just some random old man they could push around and forget about. This was someone with a history, with connections, with skills they couldn't comprehend. But the real shock was still coming. Frank reached into his torn jacket and pulled out his phone. Not a smartphone, just an old flip phone that looked like it had seen better days. He dialed a number from memory, waited for an answer, then spoke just 4 words. "This is Whisper, Code Blue." The effect was immediate. Marcus's phone began ringing, and when he answered it, his face went pale. "Yes, sir," he said into the phone, his military bearing returning instinctively. "Yes, sir, he's right here." "No, sir, he's hurt but mobile." "Understood, sir." He hung up and looked at the teenagers with something approaching pity. "You have 15 minutes to disappear," he told them. "After that, you're going to have visitors you don't want to meet." "Who's coming?" the stocky kid asked, but his question was answered by the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Not running footsteps. Measured, purposeful steps that spoke of discipline and training. 3 men in civilian clothes were walking toward them, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that said military without needing uniforms. The teenagers looked at the approaching men, then at Frank, then at each other. Whatever bravado they'd started the morning with had completely evaporated. "We're leaving," the leader said quickly. "We're just leaving." "Good choice," Frank said quietly, and there was something in his voice that sent shivers down young spines. As the teenagers hurried away, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape, the 3 men reached the bench. They were all younger than Frank, but older than Marcus, carrying themselves with the confidence of people who had seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. The first man, tall with graying hair and pale blue eyes, knelt beside Frank. "Jesus, Whisper," he said, his voice carrying decades of shared history. "What the hell happened?" "Wrong place, wrong time," Frank replied, wincing as he tried to straighten his torn jacket. "Kids thought I was easy prey." "Kids," the second man spat, his accent carrying traces of Boston. "Kids these days don't know what respect means." "They know now," Marcus said quietly, and the 3 newcomers turned to look at him properly for the first time. "Marine," the blue-eyed man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, recently discharged." "You called it in." "I recognized the tattoo, sir. Thought someone should know." The blue-eyed man nodded approvingly, then looked back at Frank. "You need medical attention?" "Nothing that won't heal," Frank said, though his labored breathing suggested otherwise. "But I appreciate the concern, Phoenix." Phoenix. Marcus had heard that code name before. whispered in the kind of places where classified operations were discussed in careful euphemisms. If Frank was a legend, Phoenix was mythology. "Come on, old man," Phoenix said, helping Frank to his feet. "Let's get you checked out properly." As they prepared to leave, Frank looked back at the scattered birdseed and the frightened pigeons who were slowly returning to investigate. "My birds," he said quietly. "We'll take care of it," the third man said, already pulling out a fresh bag of seed from somewhere in his jacket. "They won't go hungry." Frank nodded gratefully, then looked at Marcus. "Thank you, son, for stepping in." "Thank you for your service, sir. All of you." Phoenix handed Marcus a business card, blank except for a phone number. "You ever need anything? You call that number. Anyone who looks out for one of ours gets the same treatment." As the group began to walk away, Frank supporting himself between Phoenix and the Boston man, Marcus heard the third man speaking into a phone. "Yeah, it's handled. But run facial recognition on the security footage from the park. I want to know who those kids are, where they live, where they go to school. No, nothing permanent, just educational. Make sure they understand that some people are off limits." The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but also a sense of satisfaction. Justice didn't always come through official channels, and sometimes the unofficial kind was more effective. 3 weeks later, Marcus was reading the local newspaper when a small item caught his attention. 5 local teens volunteer for community service at Veterans Hospital. The article mentioned that the teenagers had approached the hospital administrators asking to work specifically with elderly veterans, citing a desire to give back to those who served. Marcus smiled, wondering what kind of education those kids had received. He'd probably never know the details, but he suspected they'd learned a valuable lesson about respect and consequences. Frank continued his morning routine in the park, but now he was never truly alone. There were always joggers nearby who nodded with recognition, dog walkers who stopped to chat, and the occasional man in civilian clothes who sat on a distant bench reading a newspaper while keeping watchful eyes on the area. The pigeons got fed every morning, just like always, but now they had protectors, and so did the quiet old man who brought them breakfast. 2 months after the incident, Frank received an unexpected visitor at his home. A young man, maybe 19 or 20, stood nervously on his front porch holding a small bouquet of flowers. "Mr. Donovan," the young man said, "my name is Tyler. I was one of the kids who attacked you in the park." Frank studied the young man's face, recognizing the lean features and nervous eyes of the leader who had thrown the first punch. "I remember you," Frank said quietly. "Sir, I wanted to apologize, not because someone made me, but because I've learned some things about who you are, about what you did for our country, and I'm ashamed." Frank looked at the flowers, then at Tyler's face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Come in, son," Frank said, stepping aside. "Let's talk." They sat in Frank's living room, surrounded by the quiet reminders of a life well lived, photos of Frank with his late wife, military commendations in simple frames, and books that spoke of a man who valued learning. "I've been volunteering at the VA hospital," Tyler said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, "working with elderly veterans, learning their stories. And Mr. Donovan, I had no idea what people like you went through for us." Frank poured coffee from a pot that was always ready, handing Tyler a mug that had seen better days. "Most people don't," Frank said simply. "That's not their fault. We didn't do it for recognition. But that doesn't excuse what I did. What we did." Tyler's voice cracked slightly. "We hurt you because we thought you were weak, because we thought being old meant being useless." Frank sipped his coffee, studying the young man with eyes that had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "What have you learned since then?" Tyler was quiet for a long moment. That the strongest people are often the quietest, that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn, and that there are consequences to every action, even when you think nobody's watching. "Good lessons," Frank said. "Hard ones, but good ones." "Mr. Donovan, is there anything I can do? Any way I can make this right?" Frank looked out the window toward the park where this had all begun. The morning sun was painting the trees in soft gold, and he could see joggers on the distant paths. "Keep volunteering at the hospital," he said finally. "Keep learning from the veterans you meet there. And remember that everyone has a story, even if they don't tell it." Tyler nodded earnestly. "I will, sir. I promise." And Tyler, next time you see someone who looks different, who moves differently, who seems like an easy target, remember this conversation. I will never forget it, sir. After Tyler left, Frank sat in his quiet house, thinking about the strange turns life could take. A beating in the park had led to education, understanding, and maybe even redemption for a young man who'd lost his way. That afternoon, Frank made his usual trip to the park, carrying his paper bag of birdseed and moving with his careful, measured steps. The pigeons greeted him like old friends, and he settled onto his bench with the satisfaction of a man whose day had purpose. As he scattered the first handful of crumbs, he noticed a young jogger approaching. Not Marcus, who still ran the park regularly and always stopped to chat, but someone new. A girl, maybe college age, with earbuds in and determination written across her face. As she passed his bench, she slowed, pulled out one earbud, and smiled.
"Good morning, sir. Beautiful day to feed the birds."
"Yes, it is," Frank replied, returning her smile. She continued her run, but Frank noticed that she dropped something near his bench, a small piece of paper. When he picked it up, he found a note written in careful handwriting. "Thank you for your service. My grandfather was Navy too, and he taught me to respect those who served in silence. Have a wonderful day. Einheit Becerra." Frank folded the note carefully and put it in his wallet, next to the worn photo of his unit from Vietnam and Tyler's handwritten apology letter. The park was different now, but in good ways. There was an awareness, a respect, a sense of community that hadn't existed before. People nodded when they passed. Joggers smiled. Dog walkers stopped to chat about everything and nothing. And somewhere in the city, 5 young men were learning about honor, service, and the true cost of freedom from the veterans they now served at the hospital. Frank finished feeding the birds and began the slow walk home, his cane tapping rhythmically on the path. Behind him, pigeons cleaned up the last of the crumbs, and ahead of him, the morning sun painted the world in shades of gold and possibility. Sometimes the worst moments in life created the best outcomes. Sometimes pain led to understanding, and violence led to wisdom. Sometimes ghosts from the past returned not to haunt, but to teach. And sometimes, feeding the birds was about more than just feeding the birds. It was about maintaining connection, preserving dignity, and remembering that every person, no matter how old, how slow, how seemingly vulnerable, has a story worth respecting. The morning joggers continued their routes, the dog walkers followed familiar paths, and the old man with the cane made his way home, knowing that tomorrow he'd return to feed the birds again. Because that's what you do when you've learned that the smallest acts of kindness can have the largest consequences, and that honor isn't something you retire from, it's something you carry until the day you die. In Riverside Park, the pigeons waited for tomorrow's breakfast, and the ghost of Team 5 walked slowly home, surrounded by the respect he'd never asked for but had finally received. Sometimes justice comes through official channels. Sometimes it comes through understanding. And sometimes it comes from the simple recognition that the quiet ones among us often have the loudest stories to tell. The sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the park in warm light and longer shadows, and life continued its gentle rhythm of mornings and memories, birdseed and brotherhood, consequences and redemption. In the end, Frank Donovan got exactly what he'd come to the park for: peace, purpose, and the knowledge that another day had been lived with dignity intact. The rest, the respect, the protection, the transformation of 5 young lives was just the universe's way of reminding everyone that ghosts have a way of haunting those who disturb them, and in the best possible way.